Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Cryptozoology. My apologies if my voice is kind of hard to understand in this video. I've been sick recently, and that has been part of why a video hasn't come up more recently, but it's also been because I want to find a suitable topic to talk about. I'm still a little bit sick, but I figure the show must go on, and I found a topic that I think is very interesting. And it's very interesting because it pertains a lot, actually, to my first video on this channel, which is the subject of extinct cryptids. In that video, I talked about my fascination, my interest, and my concerns with the subject, and that drew my attention to this topic, which relates to the extinction phenomenon in both ways, and I'll explain how that is throughout the video, particularly at the end. Today, we are going to be talking about woolly mammoths, their history, and their significance to cryptozoology based on new information that we have gathered about them. Before I go any further, I feel that a proper rundown of mammoths and their history with humanity is in order. Woolly mammoths evolved around 1 million years ago, and fairly quickly, about 500,000 years afterwards, spread out across the continents that they could. They've been to areas like Europe and France, famously Siberia, where they first evolved, actually. But they also spent a lot of their last days, especially, in North America, and they actually got there via the Bering Land Bridge. It was originally believed that mammoths were hunted to extinction about 100,000 years ago. However, new evidence suggests that they died due to a rise in temperature, which made the environment much more difficult for them. And not only that, but that it killed them much more recently than we thought it did. The original estimation of 100,000 years ago has been knocked down to somewhere between 3,000 to 6,000 years ago, which is not a long time, especially in regards to the grand scale of a species' existence. The area that they made their sort of last stand in, or that we theorize they made their last stand in, I will reveal later in the video because it's kind of a kicker. Now, as for mammoths' interaction with humanity and our interaction with mammoths, we have a fairly long history with that, especially early human tribes and groups and all that. Originally, it was believed that North American humans and mammoths didn't really have a whole lot of interaction because it was originally believed that humans arrived on North America about 20,000 or maybe even less years ago. However, new finds last year, which not only include stone tools found in California, but also include mammoth bones that have had tools used on them, suggest that humans arrived in North America a whopping 130,000 years ago, about 30,000 years before we first presumed mammoths to go extinct. So humans and mammoths not only have a longer interaction time than we thought they did, they certainly had a longer North American history with each other than we thought they did, let alone humans having more history here than we thought they did in the first place. Now, what's important about that is that's where we actually get a lot of tribal stories, especially from Inuit tribes in the Canada and Alaska region, far up north in North America. Now, the Inuit tribes have been there for a long time. Of course, the first people to come here eventually formed the Inuit tribes. So they have stories of woolly mammoths. They have a string model, which is a bit like the rubber band game where you make an object out of rubber bands with your hands that represents the woolly mammoth. They have many carvings made out of ivory that they found either fossilized or otherwise. And they have passed down legends. Now, of course, like any legend, especially in cryptozoology, a lot of it was dramatized by early settlers and later settlers to be something of a publicity stunt. The most famous example, and perhaps the best example, was the Tuchman story. Henry Tuchman was a man who claimed to know some Inuits, and when he was hanging with a few of them for a while in Alaska, he heard stories of mammoths, and he decided, I'm going to go hunt one. And apparently he did with an Inuk named Paul, and not only did they supposedly find this mammoth, but they observed very strange behavior, one of the behaviors being that a mammoth would actually be attracted to fire in order to stomp it out. What's interesting about that is we've actually recently observed birds in Australia that will purposely spread a wildfire in order to draw out smaller mammals to eat. So Tuchman was at least clever, but he was not truthful. Tuchman's story, of course, turned out to be a myth. He never encountered a mammoth and he never killed one, let alone observe its particular behavior patterns. So, for a very long time, all of it was considered legend and old stories that no longer had relevance because the species had gone extinct. However, one of the stories that kind of turned that idea on its head came from Colonel Fowler, who lived for 12 years in Alaska, having many interactions with Inuits. He lived there from 1877 to 1889. And when he finished his time there and he went home, a reporter asked him what the most interesting thing he had witnessed there was. His answer was as follows. It is a long answer, so if you'd like to skip it, you can do that. I will give a very brief rundown of what he said after I read the passage. For those of you who want to hear the passage in its entirety, I will now do that. This is how it goes. 2 years ago last summer, I left Kodiak for a trip to the headwaters of the Snake River, where our traveling agents had established a trading station at an Inuit village. The chief of this family Inuit was named Tolitima, and to him I was well recommended. He received me hospitably, and I at once began negotiations for the purchase of a big lot of fossil ivory, which his tribe had stored near the village. The lot weighed several thousand pounds, and was composed of the principal inferior tusks of the mammoth, the remains of thousands of which gigantic animals are to be found in the beds of interior Alaskan watercourses. I subjected the ivory to a rigid inspection, and upon two of the largest tusks I discovered fresh blood traces and the remnants of partly decomposed flesh. I questioned Tolitima, and he assured me that less than 3 months before, a party of his young men had encountered a drove of monsters about 50 miles above where he was then encamped, and had succeeded in killing two, an old bull and a cow. At my request, he sent for the leader of the hunting party, a young and very intelligent Indian, and I questioned him closely about his adventure among a race of animals that the scientific people claim are extinct. He told a very straightforward story, and I have no reason to doubt its truth. He and his band were searching along a dry watercourse for ivory, and had found a considerable quantity. One of the party, who was in advance, rushed upon the main body one morning with the startling intelligence that at a spring of water about a mile above where they were then, he had discovered the sign of several of the big teeth. They had come to the spring to drink from a lofty plateau further inland, and had evidently fed in the vicinity of the water for some time. The chief immediately called about him his warriors, and the party, under the leadership of the scout, approached the stream. They had nearly reached it when their ears were suddenly saluted by a chorus of loud, shrill, trumpet-like calls, and an enormous creature came crashing towards them through the thicket, the ground fairly trembling beneath its ponderous footfalls. With wild cries of terror and dismay the Indians fled, all but the chief and the scout who had first discovered the trail of the monsters. They were armed with large-caliber muskets and stood their ground, opening fire on the mammoth. A bullet must have penetrated the creature's brain, for it staggered forward and fell dead, and subsequently, on their way back to their campground, they overhauled and killed a cow, Big Teeth, which was evidently the mate of the first one killed. I asked the hunter to describe the monster, and taking a sharp stick, he drew me a picture of the pale animal in the soft clay. According to his description, it was at least 20 feet in height and 30 feet in length. In general shape, it was not unlike an elephant, but its ears were smaller, its eyes were bigger, and its trunk longer and more slender. Its tusks were yellowish-white in color and 6 in number. 4 of these tusks were placed like those of a boar, one on either side in each jaw. They were about 4 feet long and came to a sharp point. The other 2 tusks he brought away. I measured them and they were over 15 feet in length and weighed upward of 250 pounds each. They gradually tapered to a sharp point and curved inward. The monster's body was covered with long, coarse hair of a reddish dun color. So that is his story in its entirety. For those of you who wanted to skip the passage, what basically happened was he described hearing a story from an Inuit chief about a group of hunters who had killed a mammoth recently. He found the hunter who led that group, and the hunter described that they actually killed 2, what he described as an old male and a female, who he presumed to be mates, and that he actually brought Fowler the tusks, and was able to examine them. And he not only deemed them real, but he deemed them very large. And the hunter also gave a good description of the incident, how the mammoths were brought down, which was through gunfire, and the size and color of the mammoth, as well as several other physical attributes. And aside from location, which I will get to in a second here, the most interesting part about this story is certainly the physical attributes. There are many that do fit the woolly mammoth, and there are some that don't. The ones that don't particularly are the size, which could be debated to be some kind of evolutionary difference, which, fair enough. Traditionally, mammoths do not seem to have grown as large as the one told of in the story, but who knows? Coelacanths weren't that big either, millions of years ago. However, the physical attribute that really sticks out to people who read the story is the number of tusks, said to be 6 in number, which we only know woolly mammoths to have had 2 tusks. It's been theorized by people who read the story that perhaps he's describing molars and other significant teeth. That is fairly possible, although I'm not entirely sure. I'd have to see the animal myself, which obviously I'm not going to. The sound described as well, the shrill trumpet-like call, you can see several recreations of what a woolly mammoth likely sounded like, and that fits it pretty well.
Well, actually, I started with Lucy.
Lucy.
It's the first chimpanzee which started to walk, so it's considered as the first human.
And to recreate her voice, Margaret got a hold of Lucy's skeletal records to accurately reconstruct the resonance cavities in her skull. She even spoke to the surgeon who performed only the second successful human larynx transplant on a woman in California earlier this year.
Actually, he told me this very funny story that I was thinking she would get the voice of the donor.
Of someone else, right.
Yeah, and actually she recovered her own voice, meaning that the specificity of the voice doesn't come from the larynx itself, but from the way you shape air in your lungs and the way it resonates in your resonance cavities. So it meant I was on the right track.
She met with paleontologists, even an ear, nose, and throat doctor. And using resin, silicone, and rubber, she set to work rebuilding Lucy's voice box.
Because what makes the difference between a human voice and an animal sound? The difference is the brain. So they don't, we think before we talk. I mean, for most people.
Yeah. This is Lucy. The hissing you hear is a pressurized air tank, blowing air through her reconstructed vocal cords. Remember those model body parts used?
That brings us into physical attributes that do make sense, which are the smaller than elephant's ears, the larger eyes, the more slender trunk, and especially the color of the hair, because we have found somewhat mummified woolly mammoths found in the ice and all that, and the hair that we find of them is generally something like that color. So it isn't hard to imagine that this could have been what they saw. And keep in mind, this was in the very late 1800s, not up to 3,000 years ago. And that brings me to my point. Although there are many Inuit legends passed down from many generations, countless generations, of woolly mammoths that are from a time long since past, there are also recent ones, like the ones related to Fowler in 1899, which he then relayed in turn to the public of America. The significance of those stories is that they continue to be recent in that fashion. And that is part of the key that correlates woolly mammoths and their extinction period to cryptozoology. The area in which mammoths are believed to have made their final stand was an island in Alaska, roughly 2,000 to 6,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. The average is usually said to be about 4,000 years. Now, if there's anything that we can learn based off of extinction, it's that when an animal is declared extinct, there are usually a few other subjects hiding out somewhere that we don't know about. And if we're to go off of that rule to any degree, which I think is reasonable, because we can't see everywhere at the same time, quite frankly, it is possible that small populations of mammoths survived, and that would be a good explanation for why Inuits, who have never even seen an elephant before, presumably, would describe something that looks like an elephant covered in hair. Not only that, but that they would describe an animal that resembles to almost the utmost extent a classic woolly mammoth. Although there are many false stories circulating around about mammoths, the Alaskan mammoths described by Inuits are very interesting, they're very perplexing, and they're very realistic, which is perhaps their most standout feature. The Fowler story actually drew the attention of a governor at the time who publicly announced that he firmly believed that there were likely mammoths still living in Alaska, and he saw it as a very exciting opportunity. Perhaps it is time that we consider that opportunity a bit more than we have in the past, because who knows? Let me know what you all think about Fowler's story and the other stories in the comments section. Do you think that Fowler was telling the truth? Do you see any details of these Inuit stories that maybe suggest other creatures? Do you think that they're 100% talking about mammoths? What do you think of the continued survival of these cryptid mammoths? I'd love to know your opinions on that. That being said, until next time.